Well, thank you for accepting our proposal. Now let's have some fun with participles. Yeah. The many approaches to teaching participles often results in confusion and dread for many students. Just ask any early Greek student how they feel after their first participles lectures, and I have a feeling many of you have taught Greek and have experienced the blank faces. As a student, I was really confused and anxious at the idea of reading Greek because of participles. So I understand the importance of teaching participles in a way that makes more sense. Clear, logical. Our thesis today is threefold. 1, to return to understanding so-called adverbial participles as circumstantial, to use the text of Matthew's Gospel to test and continue to develop Long's Discourse, Pragmatics of Circumstantial Participles, which is DPCP from here on out. The actual syntax and information structure of the text guides our model and its application over a large body of text, Matthew's Gospel. And our third is to provide a more pedagogically nuanced and accessible approach to understanding and teaching Greek participles. Our approach acknowledges centuries of scholarship contributing to an understanding of anarthrous Greek participles as circumstantial, and seeks to distill those contributions and develop the model through application to the text in order to provide a pedagogically nuanced and accessible approach to understanding and teaching circumstantial participles. Our study led us to a review of how grammars present Greek participles, specifically anarthrous Greek circumstantial. You can see a snippet of our work here. Greek grammars present circumstantial participles in varying manners and often as adverbial, with requiring an assignment of one of the 8 adverbial senses for the purpose of translation. Temporal, you know these. A.T. Robertson in 1914 notes the hybrid nature of participles leads to a great diversity of treatment in the grammars, and he reviewed the treatment of participles in Greek grammars before him as unsatisfactory due to inconsistency. We continue to observe this inconsistency and agree with Robertson's assessment today. That's a further evaluation. Our cursory overview of grammars has demonstrated 2 main veins in the diversity of approaches: a discourse and information structure-based approach, and an approach that is geared towards English translation. The 3 main takeaways from our study are as follows. Robertson suggests that it is misleading to treat participles as adverbial, and the 8 adverbial senses are not part of the participle itself, confer also Noon in 1912. Those who take the adverbial approach generally suggest participles modify the main verb in some way, and they utilize context to further translate into English. A discourse pragmatics and information structure approach suggests that the location of the participle in the sentence vis-a-vis the nuclear verb is the key and necessary starting place. See especially Matthewson and Imig, Long, Levinson, Runge. Our process for this project started with an understanding of anarthrous Greek participles as circumstantial, and the aforementioned model. We also worked through each of the 600 plus circumstantial participles in Matthew's Gospel and all 937 of the participles in Matthew's Gospel, and analyzed the information structure and syntax to determine how each circumstantial participle was being used in its textual context. As we worked through the text, we had to continually question and adapt our model according to how the text is presenting the information.
So I've been thinking about this for some time, 2000. You can see my publications and my presentations here. And so I'm going to provide just a little bit more of a description of this model, justification for it. Some new developments is to recognize that a post-position participle can serve as a transition into the next unfolding discourse. We've also been paying attention to verb types and verbal aspect a little bit more, and then also arguments and adjuncts that attend these circumstantial participles. So why is this approach needed? Well, there's underdeterminacy of adverbial meanings in CPs. Like, that's just a thing that people are recognizing again and again and again. There's also a question about the relative position regarding the nuclear verb. That seems that people are aware that this is important. Also, verbal aspect as well. How does that relate to time, relative time or not? And increasingly, there's an understanding it doesn't have to do with relative time as much as we thought. Plus the location of the CP, as I mentioned before. So Margaret Sim, her article from 2004, using relevance theory, posited that CPs are underdetermined for adverbial meanings, including even time. Such senses must be inferred from the context. Even verbal aspect is not always a determinative factor. Also, Robert E. Piccarelli showed that both the CP's verbal aspect and its location pre- or post-position to the nuclear verb do not consistently convey relative time. So if they're not adverbial, then what do we do? Like, what's the new model? Well, we pay attention to the relative positioning, to the nuclear verb, the main verb of the clause, and then we also look for information structure for assistance. So in this regard, my model that I've been proposing and working on has been influenced by Steve Runge and Stephen Levinson. Participles, CPs, convey prioritization of action. They background information to the nuclear verb. They pre-nuclear participles, moreover, are unmarked for discontinuity, which means that they can also serve as good segues. So that comes from Levinson. Runge adds that pre-nuclear positioned participles provide frameworks, and post-nuclear participles provide redundancy or explain the main verb. Also, I found Barry and Haug's article looking at participles from information structure. They look at old versus new information and time frame, and they maintain that information structure constrains where in the sentence participles occur. They talk about CPs as free adjuncts, which elaborate, either provide more information or provide frames, or act as independent reams. Okay, so I'm starting to get like confirmation of this model from different sources. So here's the model comprehensively understood. You got the nuclear verb. Pre-nuclear participles we're putting in red, post-nuclear are in green. And so let's talk about segue. Segue use, segues from one scene into another scene. Their distance from the nuclear verb is often pretty far away. They can have connectors and their scene setting often. Motion is there or not there. Subject change may be there or not there. So here's a bridging Joseph arising from the dream. Did as he was commanded. So in this case, egerthis is really far away from the verb, and you have intervening subject and prepositional phrase. Dream is old information, and it's a scene change from the scripture quotation of the previous verses. This is a hard segue with de. We began to distinguish hard and softer segues, ke being a softer segue. So here's a softer segue, and Jesus going along from there, again, distance from the main verb. You have from there indicating an anaphoric reference, and it's also scene shifting, and this is what we considered, we began seeing as segue light. Another example, I'll skip over this for the sake of time. So we got lots of examples of these things. This was a genitive absolute present tense serving as a segue and scene shifting. Now, in terms of framework, frameworks establish important frameworks. They provide necessary information as a conceptual frame to understand the nuclear verb. Perceptional verbs are common, like hearing, seeing, but it's not always perceptional verbs. So here's a framework. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralytic, "Take courage." So this provides a framework around to understand Jesus' speech act and the following discourse. It provides an important frame. Jesus is seeing their faith. Is it temporal? Is it causal? We can debate that, but it's providing a framework, most certainly. This is a great example where you have three pre-nuclear participles that are providing frameworks for Jesus' blessing. He's commanding the crowds, he's taking the bread, and then he's looking up into heaven. All of these are providing important frameworks to understand the blessing that Jesus offers. And I think maybe for the sake of time, we're going to look at I was going to suggest looking at these as examples. The process is first identify the circumstantial participle, and then look for whether it's pre or post-nuclear in position. And so these are some examples where you have framework, and then you have the next kind of participle, which is what Emily and Reina is going to talk about.
So now we have procedural participles. Procedural participles are pre-nuclear anarthrous participles, often abutted to the nuclear verb, or nearly abutted and separated by a necessary complement or subject to the nuclear verb. The action of the participle is action that is logically prior to the nuclear verb, and it's necessary prerequisite action, but it could have been inferred in the nuclear verb. It's action that could have been inferred. I suggest this idea that procedural participles kind of function like an on-ramp, leading to or part of the action of the nuclear verb. It adds prominence to that nuclear verb, and it may contribute to thematic development, and it sometimes also conveys cultural norms present in the social and cultural context. So when I was spending a lot of time thinking about this stuff, I thought to kind of look at it as a ramp. So note here, it's using the same verb and participle as we saw in 124, but it doesn't mean it's the same pragmatic use. And I have 124 as Fred just had there. And so here we have, arising as the pre-nuclear participle, which is the on-ramp to the he took along the child. And that action of arising could have been easily inferred, but it's necessarily prerequisite action to taking along the child. Another example here we have, now when you find him, report back to me, so that also I, coming, will worship him. And there is a little bit of that cultural logic as well. Another example, extending his hand, that on-ramp that to the main verb, he touched him. So now we have post-nuclear participles, which are shown in green, and we will start with redundant participles. Redundant participles are a forward-pointing discourse marker, an emphasizing device that I think tee up the following speech as important discourse. It often slows down the discourse, it's redundant as it conveys that same action as the nuclear verb. And exclusively verbs of speech are used in Matthew's gospel. And I would like to say that it should be translated because, well, the author chose to include it. So some examples we have here are Matthew 22:43. He said to them, "How then does David by the Spirit call him Lord?" Saying, important speech then follows. And that saying should be translated because, well, choice implies meaning. And now we have explanatory participles, which are often slightly more separated from the nuclear verb. And explanatory participles are presenting action that is often additional and explanatory to the nuclear verb. The action of the participle here directly modifies the nuclear verbal action, adding more detail or elaboration to the main verb and collocating related action, but it's not necessarily action demoted vis-a-vis the nuclear verb. Essentially, it's adding more salient information for how we should understand the nuclear verb after the nuclear verb. So some examples here in Matthew 3:1. Now in those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea. And then I'm going to go on, because time, to one of our favorite examples, I would say, because it has a great procedural participle and then, these great explanatory participles as well, and it's the Great Commission. So going, therefore, as that on-ramp to the nuclear verb action, going, therefore, make disciples of all nations, and then the explanatory, explaining what is entailed in that making disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And so those two post-nuclear explanatory participles really show how we understand these circumstantial participles to work post-nuclear.
So the last usage, we weren't seeing too many of these in Matthew's Gospel, transitional. I was looking at them all along. One of my favorite verses is, be filled with the Spirit, and then there's a listing of those 5 participles, submitting to one another. And then I began to realize that is transitional. In fact, the verb hupostasso is implied in Ephesians, what follows. So in Matthew's Gospel, we found 8 clear examples, 4 possible examples. The clear examples, one of them is really interesting. The mother of John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. Now that request is delayed because Jesus asked, what is it that you want? So we're already given this participle that is saying that she has a request. We're delayed in getting it, and then the request comes a verse and a half later. So I think that's a transitional opening up to expect that request. Then you have these programmatic sections, right? We have 4:23 and 9:35, which are almost verbatim the same. Jesus was going around teaching, preaching, and healing. Well, in the intervening discourse, in fact, we actually see Jesus' teaching. In 8:2 to 9:34, we have 10 healings, 9 healings, 1 miracle, plus you have these calling of people to be disciples. So in a sense, you have an illustration of his healings and his preaching. So these post-nuclear participles are programmatic, and they're actually transitioning to help us understand the next discourse. Then they also occur in 9:35, which again is preparing for the need to send out harvesters into the harvest. And I think then Jesus sends the disciples out. So again, it's programmatic and I think pointing forward. So some major observations as we conclude here. Segue CPs bridge settings. They shift the scene's location, time, or actors. They can serve as boundary markers, whether hard with de or tote or light with ke. And framework CPs set up an important conceptual interpretive framework. They often involve verbs of perception, but not always. Many are GAs, genitive absolutes. As a default, we thought GAs are going to be frameworks, but indeed we did find some that were segues. Never procedural. Procedural CPs are primarily teeing up the nuclear verb. They demonstrate the difficulty of applying adverbial senses, like procedurals. It's hard to do that. They're often treated as attendant circumstance and translated as a finite verb, yet this obscures their function in Greek, which is to background that information and to highlight the nuclear verb. Redundant use offsets what follows as important speech. Explanatory uses are the adverbial playground, but we advise caution here. Transitional uses are rare, we found, yet can be programmatic. And supplying adverbial senses to post-nuclear participles is a secondary step, not a first step, to teach students, look for these adverbial senses. We don't think that that's what's going on.
And now for our conclusion. I think this model has pedagogical benefits. So acknowledging the role of the larger context to discern old and new information is something that's clearly important. And I suggest that exercises with only one sentence do not provide enough context to infer adverbial senses or old or new information. So context is our friend in our teaching as we, have students translate small sentences in small bits to give them that context to be able to understand and navigate. Now, as a student, I would often get frustrated with having to apply one of 8 adverbial senses when my fellow students would come up with many different ideas and I could find nothing in the text that actually affirmed necessarily one over the other. So I suggest that since circumstantial participles are not inherently marked for adverbial senses, this approach offers a streamline. And here's kind of how we do this. Find the participle, find the circumstantial participle, determine whether each is pre or post the nuclear verb. If it's pre-nuclear, consider segue, framework, and or procedural uses in that line of order. And if it's post-nuclear, consider redundant, explanatory, or transitional uses. And so, that's...
Wow, our practice paid off.
Oh yeah, we did such a good job.
Yeah, we had to go over some of those examples fast, but I got my logos up. We could look at any, if we want to look at examples. We got bonus material, got some stats and all that kind of stuff.
We've got a lot of extra.
Yeah, we got a lot of time.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I especially appreciate the focus on pedagogy. I have one question on just the example from Ephesians 5 and the distinction. If there's any overlap, I would identify in that example whether the submission in verse 21 is explaining the commands to be filled with the Spirit in verse 18, or if it's transitioning them. How much overlap? Does transitional mean that it's not referring back to the being filled, it's just the subject, or is there
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would say yes. It's doing both. So something that we didn't make clear, it's my fault, is that these pre-nuclear uses, there can be some overlap. Like I think in the ancient mind, they're not thinking only one thing, so there can be some overlap. So in our analysis, we really wrestled through how do we do this. In this case, I think it is elaborating that being filled with the Spirit, which has huge implications, obviously, but then it's also serving as a transition, obviously, because the verb is implied in the talking about the wife in relation to her husband, and then it's applied to Christ in the church. So I think it's a both and. Segues often provide a little bit of a framework, it seems like, but then they also seem to be real scene shifting. But usually we can make a distinction, but sometimes we were wrestling with whether both. And we just put both, sometimes with a question mark. But it's worth talking about. At least we're talking about the model. Yeah.
Yes.
Just on that same point, looking at that fifth participle and then what follows, it almost feels like that's a heading for the man-woman relationship, for the slave-master relationship, and for the parent-child relationship that follows.
Yeah.
And
it opens it up.
So you're thinking, like from a grammatical perspective, if you could find a way to have a single participle govern all of that material that follows, you say like that's impossible.
Yeah.
So they have to set the stage for it, and then he veers off into different grammatical structures and starting new sentences and all the rest.
Yeah.
But as far as a larger like rhetorical flow, that's the heading for the almost. To chapter 6 verse.
Yeah, but I think the important thing is that it's coming off of being filled with the Spirit. So what that means then is that those core household relationships, for them to be functioning well or properly, comes out of the life of the being filled with the Spirit. Yeah, subsumed under, yeah.
Yes, in the white shirt.
Oh, I was just curious. It sounds like this is part of inside of the textbook. I'm curious. Has there been any exposure to students and exposing this type of pedagogical approach to them? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so in Fred's KGG Koine Greek Grammar, they use a model similar to this, a previous version of this. And, so I'm tutoring a lot of the Greek students as they're learning participles. And so as they come out of their participles lecture, I kind of bring this out and I show it to them in a line and say, okay, let's look at how this is working. And so I think when I have an opportunity to sit down with students and have them go through the process of identifying the nuclear verb and then identifying the position of the participle, I've seen students come away from 1 hour tutoring sessions being like, oh, okay, I can do this. I can see where nuclear verb is, and I can see where these participles are and how they're working. So I would say that I've had some pedagogical success in this, yes. Yes, Nate?
We had a third row here, hand up several times.
Yeah, say thank you very much. This is great. As a longtime Greek teacher, I really appreciate what you're doing. Now, what I usually tell my students is this, and I'm starting from the end of your presentation, where you said context is your friend.
Yeah.
Right? I think this is the most important thing. Because essentially, participles are shorthand.
Yeah, that's right.
They are shorthand.
Yeah.
And I think this is the essential thing that has to be gotten through to students.
Yeah.
They're shorthand.
Yeah.
In a predicate position, they're shorthand for some kind of subordinate clause kind of thing. If it's in a tributive position, it's shorthand for a relative clause. Now, they're not completely coterminous with a relative clause, and James Kencher can talk more about this. But here's my point. What if it's shorthand for a subordinate clause? What sort of, let's say, adverbial introducer, like since, or when, or because, or although, are you shorthanding? That's where the context comes in. So in other words, it's not a matter simply of the position or something like this, as if you can figure this out technically, but you're sort of asking yourself, there's a subordinating conjunction that is shorthand for what does the context suggest? And there are really tricky examples of this. Where, you know, a bunch, like you guys have said, a bunch of different things are possible.
Yeah.
But I'd also like to add one more thing. You have to realize that there is a kind of a Greek style component here. For example, a Stan Porter view is that in general, the time relationship is relative to the positioning of the main verb. So if the participle comes later, it's afterward. Well, that's actually not true in Greek, though.
Yeah.
And it's especially not true if you're trying to do something a little fancy, like the phragalosas in Mark chapter 15, verse 15, that he handed him over, and then phragalosas, aorist participle, circumstantial, comes afterward. Well, only if you're a really good writer do you have a participle in the aorist following the main verb having action before the main verb.
Yeah.
So let's you guys have a response?
Well, I'm not sure what the question is, but I think I think Jim, you're talking about attributive participles that we. No, okay, good. Because I was going to say no. I try to translate participles very minimally. Yes. And I think that works really well, and that's how.
Should be thinking of them as shorthand for.
Yeah, their efficiency is, so we got to think of them from the perspective of efficiency, but they can add a dynamicity because they can have adjuncts, right? So that's what distinguishes them from adjectives when they're functioning adjectively. Is they add this verbal dynamicity to it, so they're efficient and dynamic at the same time.
We have one more question in the back there.
We have time
Nate?
for one more.
Maybe you could elaborate on the difference, or like kind of elaborate on the transitional participles and how they're different from
So they're post-nuclear. They're opening up into a new. I think they tend to be more topically salient as opposed to segues, which are moving from one scene to another. So in that regard, they're different placements. So one's pre-nuclear. Pre-nuclear ones tend to be aorist, perfective. Whereas the post-nuclear are going to be present tense, imperfective.
I think we have a handout, and if you didn't get it, I can get it to you after, that has a little bit more of that explanation and is helpful in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Well, you can...
We do have time for one last question right here in the front.
I just wonder if you could go back to the Math 2819 example. And the March discussed relationship between the Paracentes and the Participles. I just want to test if I've heard you right. Often people try to say that the Paracentes is merely adverbial to the Participles, and in some versions of that, there's no imperatival force given Paracentes at all. Make a cycle.
Yeah.
If it's an on-ramp, are you saying just an on-ramp in the organising of information? Or do you think there's something about the situation of, for example, a person giving a command and the implied logic then of going from the presence of the person commanding into the unbounded state of obedience, or even going from a mission to Israel into the implied movement into the nations, that gives a linkage of imperatival force into the Paracentes.
One of the things that I would say is yes, but I would go back to the fact that participles are underdetermined, right? So they're requiring anarthrous Greek participles, circumstantial, but especially pre-nuclear, are requiring inferring, right? They're requiring and leaving room for that. And so I'm not personally willing to call a pre-nuclear participle as an imperatival participle, but yes, there can be those senses involved with it and in our understanding of it. So
I think they can contribute to thematic development because in the beginning of Matthew you have a lot of coming and going, and then I think you're right that there is something about, rather than the law streaming out from Zion and the nations will come in, now we're actually going out. So that is an important part of the logic of the mission, I think. So we're
out of time.
Yeah.
So,